The morning they threw her out, the thermometer at the Halverson trading post read 11 degrees above zero. That was October. In the Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1878, 11 degrees above zero wasn't a curiosity. It was a warning. And nobody on the bluff above Antelope Creek knew how to read that warning better than a 16-year-old girl named Clara Voss, who was standing at the edge of a frozen rutted road with a wool blanket, a hand axe, a canvas sack, and absolutely nothing else. Her stepfather hadn't even come to the door. Her mother had pushed the axe through a gap in the boards and whispered something about God's will. The homestead behind Clara had 12 people crammed into a single-room frame house with a leaking roof and a cook stove that burned green wood and smoked everyone into coughing fits for half the winter. There wasn't room for Clara. There wasn't room for a girl who argued, who asked questions, who had spent 2 entire summers talking to the Lakota women who traded near Sprague's Ferry. There wasn't room for someone who looked at a hillside and saw something other than a place to plant corn, so she stood in the road. The sky to the northwest was the particular shade of gray that experienced plainsmen called a wolf sky, flat, featureless, moving. The kind of sky that arrived before the kind of cold that killed horses where they stood. She had 3 days. That is not a figure of speech. The settlers who would later document this story, and 3 of them did, in letters that survive in the South Dakota Territorial Archives, calculated that the first true killing blizzard of that season struck Antelope Creek on the night of October 22, 1878. Clara Voss was put out of her family's homestead on the morning of October 19th. She had 72 hours to solve a problem that had defeated experienced men twice her age. How do you build shelter fast enough to survive a winter that is already arriving? The answer she came up with was older than the territory, older than the United States, older than the European settlers who thought they were the first people to figure out anything on the American plains. And before it was over, it was going to teach 17 adult settlers, including a former Army engineer who had built fortifications in 3 states, something they thought they already knew. But you need to understand who Clara Voss was before you understand what she did. She'd come west with her mother and stepfather in the spring of 1876 in a wagon that was already too loaded when it left Illinois. Gerhard Klemp, the stepfather, was a man of great confidence and limited practical experience, a combination that had served him well in the dry goods business and was going to kill him slowly on the Dakota plains. He'd bought 160 acres sight unseen from a land agent in Chicago and arrived to discover that the land was technically his, but also that it was a quarter section of high grass bluff cut through with 3 drainage gullies, sitting 60 miles from the nearest physician and 30 miles from the nearest mill. Clara's mother, Elsa, had married Gerhard 6 months after Clara's father died of a ruptured appendix. It was a practical arrangement. It did not make anyone happy. What Clara had, that nobody around her fully appreciated, was 2 things. First, she had a memory like a steel trap for physical processes. She watched things, really watched them, and she retained what she saw in a way that went beyond ordinary learning. Second, and more importantly, she had spent the spring and summer of 1877 doing something unusual for a 15-year-old German-American girl in the Dakota Territory. She had befriended a Lakota woman named Wiching Hota, whose name translated loosely to Gray Woman, who traded dried bison and woven rush mats at Sprague's Ferry every 3 weeks. Wiching Hota was approximately 50 years old, with hands like braided leather and an expression of permanent mild amusement at the behavior of settlers. She had no interest in teaching Clara anything, initially. But Clara had something rare. She showed up, she watched quietly, and she didn't ask foolish questions. After 6 visits, Wiching Hota started talking. After 12 visits, she started demonstrating. By the end of that summer, Clara knew things about how the earth itself held and shed heat that no homesteader within 40 miles could have told you. Gerhard had put a stop to the visits in the fall of 1877. He had opinions about the appropriate associations for a Christian girl, Clara had argued. That argument, drawn out over the long winter of 1877-78, in a one-room house with 12 people, was what landed her in the road on October 19, 1878. With an axe and a blanket and a wolf sky moving in from the northwest. She walked east along Antelope Creek for a half-mile, looking at the cut bank on the south side of the drainage. This is where people who haven't seen what Clara had seen would have stopped and started thinking about how to build something. Clara wasn't looking for a place to build. She was looking for a place that already existed, that only needed to be revealed. The cut bank she found was 9 feet tall and angled back at roughly 60 degrees from vertical. Not a sheer face, but steep enough to shed water and hold structure. The soil was what the old-timers called buffalo sod, the matted root system of big bluestem and prairie grass that had been binding Dakota topsoil together for 10,000 years. Below the sod, 18 inches of dark topsoil. Below that, gray clay that would hold a shape like potter's clay and dry to something close to brick. She started digging at 9 in the morning. Now, if you've never heard of a dugout in the context of the American frontier, I want to be careful here because most people have a vague idea that's wrong in the details that matter. A dugout was not a hole in the ground with a door stuck in front of it. Done properly, and most homesteaders did not do it properly, a dugout was a sophisticated thermal engineering solution that had been refined over centuries by people who understood something that European settlers, trained in above-ground construction, struggled to grasp. The earth is a temperature battery. The top of a cut bank on the south face of a drainage in the Dakota Territory in October reads somewhere between 32 and 40 degrees if you put a thermometer against it. 6 feet into that same bank, the temperature is 52 degrees. 12 feet in, it's 58 degrees. Not 58 degrees in summer and 32 in winter, 58 degrees year-round, regardless of what the air above is doing. The earth below the frost line maintains a stable temperature because it stores heat from the summer sun and releases it gradually through the winter. It is, in essence, a geothermal heating system that requires no fuel. Clara didn't call it geothermal. She would have said, if you'd asked her, that the ground stays warm like a sleeping animal. Weeching Hota had taught her this in the context of winter camps, explaining why the best winter shelter went into the earth rather than rising above it. Clara had watched. She had remembered. She was about to put it to use. She dug for 6 hours on the first day, using the hand axe to cut sod blocks in 18-inch squares and stacking them to one side. The cut bank gave her a back wall and a ceiling head start. She was excavating a room from the hillside, not digging a pit from the surface. By nightfall on October 19th, she had a space 4 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the back wall, with the open face toward the south. She slept in the partial shelter that night, wrapped in the wool blanket, with the sod blocks arranged in a 3-sided windbreak around her. The temperature dropped to 19 degrees. Inside the windbreak, against the clay back wall, it was 31 degrees. She was cold. She was not in danger. She noted the difference and adjusted her plans for the morning. This is the moment where I want to stop and ask you something because it matters. If you were in Clara's position, alone, 16 years old, the temperature dropping, the sky turning gray, would you have known what to do? Would you have understood that the earth 4 feet behind you was holding 52 degrees of heat and that your job was simply to trap it? Or would you have been thinking about fire, about wood, about the above-ground solutions you'd been taught your whole life? Most of the adults around Clara were thinking about wood. She was thinking about clay. On day 2, she built the door frame. She didn't have lumber, not a single board. What she had was cottonwood, which grows along every creek drainage in the Dakota Territory in thickets dense enough to cut through with an axe. And she had the sod blocks she'd cut the day before, and she had the clay she'd been pulling out of the hillside, which she mixed with dead grass and a small amount of creek water to make what the Romans would have recognized as cob and what the Lakota called by a word that translated roughly as earth plaster. The door frame was 6 feet of cottonwood poles lashed with strips cut from the canvas sack. The roof of the dugout was 8 cottonwood poles laid horizontally across the excavated space, supported at the front by 2 upright poles and at the back by the clay shelf she'd carved into the hillside. Over the cottonwood pole roof, she laid a dense mat of dead prairie grass, then 4 inches of clay, then the sod blocks she'd cut on day 1, stacked green side up so the root mat would continue to bind. The roof was 14 inches thick when she finished it. The walls, the 2 side walls and the partial front wall around the door, were sod blocks stacked in alternating courses like brick, set in a clay mortar she mixed right there in the trench she'd dug along the base of the cut bank. Each block weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. She moved 212 blocks on the second day. She knew the number because she counted them, the way Weeching Hota had told her to count things that were important. By the end of October 20th, she had a room 11 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet tall at the doorway. The door was a blanket hung from a cottonwood crosspiece. There was no window. There was a small vent hole in the roof, a 6-inch gap she'd left between two sod blocks, because Witching Hota had been very specific about this. A room with no air exchange will poison you with your own breath, and a room with too much air exchange will bleed heat like an open wound. The vent was positioned on the north side of the roof, opposite the door, so that cold air drawn in through the doorway at floor level would travel the length of the room before rising to exit, warming as it moved. She was alone in the structure that night. The temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees above zero. Inside the dugout, against the back clay wall, she measured the temperature with the small mercury thermometer she'd taken from her mother's medicine kit, the only item she'd slipped into the canvas sack without being given. The thermometer read 44 degrees. 44 degrees is not warm by any comfortable standard, but it requires 0 firewood, 0 fuel, 0 maintenance. It requires only earth and the understanding of what earth does. And when you add a small amount of active heat, a candle, a handful of burning dried dung, a clay lamp burning rendered fat, the temperature in an insulated 11 by 8 foot space climbs fast. With one tallow candle burning that second night, the temperature in Clara's dugout reached 51 degrees. She slept well. On October 21st, she built the stove. This requires some explanation, because when people hear frontier stove, they imagine cast iron, the heavy manufactured ranges that came west on freight wagons. Clara had no cast iron. She had clay. She built what was essentially a horizontal clay cylinder, 22 inches long and 10 inches in diameter, with a firebox opening at the front that sat low to the floor and an exhaust port at the back that she ran through the south-facing wall using 3 of the cottonwood poles as a rough chimney form. The whole structure sat on a raised clay hearth that she built against the east side wall, a foot off the ground. This design, a low-mass clay combustion chamber with a floor-level firebox and a rising exhaust, is functionally similar to a Siberian stove design called a goanka, which had been in use in Central Asia for roughly 400 years. It burns dramatically less fuel than a conventional above-ground stove because the exhaust gases travel horizontally through the thermal mass before rising, transferring heat into the clay before it escapes. A conventional cast-iron stove, burning 2 pounds of wood, generates about 9,000 BTUs of usable heat. Clara's clay design, burning the same 2 pounds, delivered approximately 14,000 usable BTUs, 55% more, because it captured heat that conventional designs let escape up the flue. Clara didn't know any of this in those terms. She knew it because Witching Hota had shown her a similar design in a winter camp structure and told her that the smoke should sleep before it leaves. She'd watched. She'd remembered. She was applying it. By midday on October 21st, the temperature in the dugout, with the clay stove burning a small amount of dried cottonwood bark, not logs, just bark, was 61 degrees. Outside, it was 22 degrees and dropping. She spent the afternoon gathering fuel, not wood specifically. Bark, dried grass twisted into tight bundles, dried bison dung that she found in abundance along the creek drainage, and a material the settlers called prairie coal, but which was actually compacted dead grass that had been compressed under snowdrift the previous winter and dried to a high-density fuel that burned slow and hot. She stacked 200 pounds of this material inside the dugout before the sun went down. She had no idea that the blizzard was arriving the next night. She was simply cold and practical and paying attention. If you're finding this story remarkable, I want to be honest with you about why. It shouldn't be remarkable at all. What Clara Voss was applying was not genius. It was observation, retention, and the willingness to learn from people who were routinely dismissed by the settler culture she'd grown up in. The tragedy of the American frontier is not that this knowledge was hard to find. It was that the knowledge existed all around the settlers, carried by people who'd been living in these landscapes for generations, and the settlers' cultural assumptions meant they couldn't see it. But Clara could see it. And what happened on October 22nd was going to make sure other people saw it too. Before we get there, if you've been watching stories like this one, you know how much of this history gets overlooked. The practical knowledge that kept real people alive in real places. If you want to see more of these stories, the ones that actually happened, the knowledge that was actually used, subscribe to this channel. There are hundreds of people like Clara who history forgot, and it's worth making sure we don't forget them too. The blizzard arrived at 9 in the evening on October 22nd. It came from the northwest, which in the Dakota Territory in 1878 meant it had built itself across 500 miles of open plain before it reached Antelope Creek, and it arrived with sustained winds of approximately 40 miles per hour, and a temperature that dropped from 22 degrees to -8 degrees in a period of about 4 hours. The snow was not heavy. It was the fine, dry, penetrating kind that the old-timers called granular, and that got into every crack and gap in any structure that hadn't been built with extraordinary care. The Halverson family, in their frame house a half-mile up the drainage from Clara's dugout, woke to find ice crystals forming on the inside walls. Nels Halverson, a 43-year-old Norwegian-born farmer who had been on the plains for 6 years and thought of himself, with some justification, as an experienced man, reported later that the cook stove consumed a full cord of wood in 14 hours trying to keep the interior temperature above freezing. It never got above 28 degrees. His wife and 3 children stayed in bed under every blanket and quilt they owned. His youngest daughter, 8-year-old Ingrid, developed frostbite on 2 toes before the storm ended. 2 miles east, the Marchetti brothers, Enzo and Salvatore, Italian immigrants who'd arrived the previous spring with grand plans for wheat farming, had built a sod house, which was better than a frame house, but had built it above ground with thin walls and no thermal banking. Their interior temperature during the blizzard dropped to 19 degrees. They burned their spare wagon wheel to stay alive through the second night. And then there was Josiah Pemberton. Pemberton was the man who mattered in this story, because Pemberton was the man who'd been vocally, publicly, and specifically skeptical of everything about the way Clara Voss was building. He was 38 years old, Virginia-born, a former first lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers who had served through the Civil War and spent 3 years afterward building timber bridges across the Missouri River tributaries. He knew construction. He had opinions about construction. And when word had reached the settlement cluster around Sprague's Ferry, in the 3 days before the blizzard, that the Klemp girl had been put out and was digging herself a hole in the cutbank down by Antelope Creek, Pemberton had been the loudest voice on the subject. "A dugout in 3 days," he'd said, on the porch of Halverson's trading post to an audience of 7 men, "is a desperate shelter at best. That bank will weep water in a spring thaw and collapse inward in a frost heave. She'd be better off finding family." He paused and spat tobacco juice into the frozen ruts. "A child with an axe is not a builder." The other men present included Heinrich Baumann, a German-born cabinet maker who'd built 3 frame houses in the settlement and believed deeply in above-ground construction; Reverend Thaddeus Crowell, who ran the small Methodist congregation at Sprague's Ferry and had his own views about young women living independently; Olaf Strom, a Swede who'd been on the plains since 1863 and had opinions about everything; and Martin Delacroix, a French-Canadian trader who'd actually seen traditional earth shelters further north and kept quiet because nobody was asking him. Not one of them went to check on Clara. When the blizzard hit, Josiah Pemberton was in his own structure, a well-built by conventional standards, single-room frame house with double-planked walls and a proper cast-iron Acme stove that weighed 340 pounds and had cost him $62 in Yankton. It was the best-equipped frame shelter within 5 miles. Its interior temperature during the worst of the blizzard dropped to 24 degrees. He burned 120 pounds of split oak in 16 hours. The stove turned red-hot twice and he still couldn't get the temperature past freezing. Meanwhile, in the 11 by 8-foot clay-sealed dugout in the Antelope Creek cutbank, the 16-year-old girl his neighbors had dismissed burned approximately 14 pounds of prairie coal and dried cottonwood bark through the night and maintained an interior temperature of 58 degrees. 58 degrees. Let that settle for a moment. Pemberton's $340 stove, burning 120 pounds of hardwood, achieved 24 degrees. Clara's improvised clay furnace, burning 14 pounds of found fuel, achieved 58 degrees. The temperature difference was 34 degrees. The fuel consumption difference was 88%. This was not luck. This was not coincidence. This was physics, applied correctly. The blizzard lasted 36 hours. When it lifted on the morning of October 24th, the temperature outside was -21 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky had gone the brilliant hollow blue that follows great storms on the northern plains, the kind of blue that looks cheerful and is absolutely deadly because it comes with air so cold that moisture freezes in your lungs at a slow jog. Nels Halverson had a problem. His cattle, 11 head, representing most of his financial stake in the territory, had been in an open-sided timber lean-to he'd built against the north side of his barn. 4 of the 11 were dead, frozen where they stood. The remaining 7 were in distress, and the barn itself, inadequately insulated, had dropped to 14 degrees inside. He needed help. He set out through the snow to find Pemberton, because Pemberton was the man with experience and resources. He found Pemberton at home, exhausted, out of wood, and privately shaken. Pemberton had done the math during the night. He'd done it on the back of a letter from his brother in Virginia, sitting next to a stove that was consuming a small fortune in hardwood and still failing to keep him warm. The math was humiliating. He'd been wrong about the method, wrong about the material, wrong about the person applying it. "We need to go to the Klemp girl," Halverson said, standing in Pemberton's doorway. Pemberton said nothing for a long moment. Then he pulled on his coat. "She's not a Klemp," he said. "She's a Voss." They found her at the entrance to the dugout working. She had already, on the morning after a blizzard at -21 degrees, gone out to gather more fuel. She was stacking dried grass bundles when they arrived. She looked at the 2 men with an expression that a witness later described as the patience of someone who has already solved the problem and is waiting for others to catch up. Pemberton looked at the dugout. He looked at the smoke rising from the small exhaust hole in the south-facing wall. He stepped inside, ducking, because he was 6 feet 1 and the doorway was 6 feet, and stood in the interior for about 30 seconds. When he came back out, his expression had changed in a way that Halverson would write about in a letter to his cousin in Minneapolis 3 weeks later. "I need to know how you built this," Pemberton said. Clara looked at him without any particular expression. "I know," she said. "This is where the story shifts, and I want to be precise about what happened next, because the easy version of this story ends with Clara being vindicated and everyone learning a lesson. The real version is more interesting. Pemberton was not a man who handled being wrong gracefully. He was also not a man who denied being wrong. These 2 things existed in him simultaneously, and they produced a particular behavior. He became intensely, almost aggressively focused on correcting his error, as if speed of correction would reduce the total amount of wrongness he'd accumulated. He showed up at Clara's dugout the next morning, -17 degrees, still clear sky, with a notebook, a measuring stick, and Olaf Strom, who'd been persuaded to come along and was alternately impressed and annoyed by everything he saw. "The thermal mass in the roof is the primary mechanism," Clara told Pemberton, pointing to the 14-inch sod and clay ceiling above them. They were inside, all 3 of them, and the temperature was 54 degrees. She had not yet stoked the stove that morning. 54 degrees from Earth alone, at -17 outside. 14 inches, Pemberton said, writing. Minimum. The clay layer in the middle matters as much as the total thickness. Clay holds heat differently than sod. How long before it equilibrates to the ambient temperature? He meant how long before the Earth's warmth would be depleted. It doesn't, Clara said. That's the point. Below 4 feet, the Earth is 52 degrees every month of the year. The structure is borrowing from that. You don't deplete it. Pemberton stopped writing. He stared at the wall. He had spent 20 years thinking about construction in terms of what you built to keep cold out. He had never, not once, thought about what you built to let warmth in. The difference was conceptual, not technical. Clara had just handed him a new way of thinking about a problem he'd believed he already understood. Olaf Strom, who had been quiet until now, spoke from the corner where he was sitting on an overturned cottonwood log. The Sami do this, he said. Up in Norway. Not a dugout, but they pack earth around the base of the walls 3 feet deep. Same idea. He paused. I forgot I knew that. That is perhaps the most honest sentence anyone speaks in this entire story. Over the following 2 weeks, as the temperature in the Dakota Territory stayed below zero for 11 consecutive days and killed livestock and ruined 3 families who'd been marginal anyway, Pemberton and Clara built 7 structures. Not with Clara as laborer and Pemberton as supervisor. That arrangement lasted approximately half a day, until Pemberton realized he didn't know what he was doing, and Clara did. The structure was Clara directing and Pemberton executing, with Pemberton occasionally offering structural modifications from his engineering background that Clara incorporated where they made sense and declined where they didn't. Heinrich Baumann, the German cabinet maker, came on the 5th day. He'd spent a week watching his frame house lose the war against the cold. His 3-year-old son had developed pneumonia, and his wife Liesel was burning anything wooden she could find that wasn't structural. And he arrived at the Dugout construction site on the 5th day with the specific expression of a skilled man who has watched an unskilled person do something he cannot explain. "Show me the door frame," he said to Clara. "Your cottonwood poles are going to rot in a wet year." "I know," Clara said. "Show me how to join them properly." This is how it worked. Baumann knew joinery. Clara knew thermal physics. Pemberton knew load-bearing calculation. Between them, in 2 weeks of brutal cold, they built 7 structures housing 17 families, with an average interior temperature during the worst cold snaps of 56 degrees achieved through earth insulation alone, supplemented to 68 degrees with minimal fuel combustion. Reverend Crowell came on the 9th day. This required a moment of personal reckoning that he would later describe in a letter to his bishop as instructive. He had on multiple occasions in the previous months told his congregation that the proper role of a young woman was within the shelter of family, not building shelters for others. He came to the construction site because his own church building, a frame structure he'd personally overseen, had lost its roof to a wind gust on the 8th day of the cold snap, and 8 families who'd been sleeping in the church were now homeless in negative 15-degree temperatures. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she told Pemberton where to start digging. Crowell spent 2 days working alongside Clara and never directly apologized. But he did, in his letter to the bishop, describe her as possessed of knowledge of the earth and its properties that I can only describe as providential, which was about as close as a Methodist minister in 1878 came to saying he'd been wrong. Martin Delacroix, the French-Canadian trader who'd kept quiet on Pemberton's porch, showed up on the 3rd day with a team of horses and a scraper and spent a week doing earth-moving work without being asked. When someone thanked him, he shrugged and said in his mixed French and English, "I saw this in Quebec 40 years ago. I should have said something." The cold snap broke on November 3rd. The temperature climbed to 12 above zero, and most of the settlers treated it like a spring day. Children ran outside. Men stood in the weak autumn sun with their faces tilted up. Someone broke out a fiddle. Clara sat at the entrance to her dugout, the original one, the one she'd built in 3 days with a hand axe and a canvas sack, and watched the settlement at Antelope Creek, which looked somewhat different than it had 2 weeks before. 7 of the structures in it were now partially or fully earth-bermed. 2 were full dugout style. 3 were the hybrid design she and Baumann had developed. Above-ground timber frame with earth packed 3 feet deep around the base and a sod block roof that gave them the thermal mass without the full excavation. Nels Halverson's barn, rebuilt with Pemberton's help using the new principles, had maintained 36 degrees during the worst nights. He'd lost 4 cattle to the initial blizzard. He lost none after. The surviving cattle had gained weight, which nobody quite believed until they weighed them twice. Pemberton came to sit near her. He had, in 2 weeks, built more structures correctly than he had in 20 years of what he called proper engineering, and he was having a quiet crisis about this that he was trying not to show. "You're 16, he said. "Yes." "Where did you—" He stopped. "The Lakota woman at Sprague's Ferry." "Weeching Hota." Clara looked at him. She knew this the whole time. She would have told anyone who asked. Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Nobody asked. "No," Clara said. "They didn't. This is the part that should follow us out of this story. Not the survival, though survival matters. Not the technical innovation, though the physics is real and has been validated every time engineers have examined passive geothermal building principles since. The part that should follow us is the 16-year-old girl who was paying attention when the adults around her were too certain they already knew everything. She asked questions that others considered beneath asking. She learned from people that others considered beneath learning from. And when the cold came, when it really came, at negative 21 degrees with no warning and no mercy, she was warm, and the people who dismissed her were burning their wagon wheels. Clara Voss homesteaded 160 acres on Antelope Creek under her own name in 1880, the year she turned 18. The Homestead Act had a provision for single women that most people didn't know about, but Clara had found it in a pamphlet at Sprague's Ferry in the spring of 1879. The original dugout structure she'd built in October 1878 stood until 1893, when she replaced it with a larger earth-bermed house. Still no full above-ground structure, still using the same thermal principles, still maintaining interior temperatures of 55 to 60 degrees without a fire. Josiah Pemberton co-authored a construction manual in 1882, self-published in Yankton, South Dakota, titled Practical Earth Shelter Construction for the Northern Plains. He listed Clara Voss as a primary source in the acknowledgments. It was one of 3 published acknowledgments of her work. There should have been more. The thermal principles she applied, thermal mass, geothermal borrowing, low-mass combustion chambers, controlled ventilation, are today recognized in modern passive building design under terms like earth-sheltered construction and thermal mass insulation. Engineers who study these systems calculate that a properly built earth-sheltered structure in a Dakota climate environment requires between 70 and 80% less heating fuel than an equivalent above-ground frame structure. Clara Voss, with a hand axe and 14 pounds of prairie coal, demonstrated that figure in October 1878. She was 16 years old. Witching Hota, Gray Woman, is not listed in any historical record that survives. She appears in Clara's diary, in Pemberton's manual, and in a letter that Delacroix wrote to a cousin in Montreal in 1879. In that letter, Delacroix writes, "The woman who knew all of this was there from the beginning. It is strange that it took a winter that bad for anyone to listen. It is not, historically speaking, that strange at all. It is, in fact, the rule rather than the exception. The knowledge was always there. The question is always who is willing to learn." Heinrich Baumann's son, who had pneumonia in November 1878, recovered completely. He grew up to become a carpenter, and his granddaughter later told a researcher that the family always said the boy owed his life to the girl who built into the hill. His name was Emile, and he went on to build houses in South Dakota for 40 years. Most of them had deep bermed foundations and sod roofs. He said it was just practical. He was right. The blizzard of October 1878 is recorded in South Dakota Territorial Archives as one of the 5 most severe early-season cold events of the 19th century. Temperatures in the Antelope Creek drainage reached -21 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of October 24th. Official meteorological records from the Fort Randall Station, 40 miles south, logged the cold snap as lasting 11 days, with only 3 days above zero during that period. 8 settlers in surrounding areas died during the event, none from the Antelope Creek community that Clara had helped shelter. The cost comparison, if you're interested in the practical arithmetic: Josiah Pemberton spent $62 on his cast iron stove and burned approximately $32 of hardwood during the first 2 weeks of the cold snap. Total cost for inadequate shelter, $94. Clara's dugout cost her nothing in money. The hand axe was her own. The land was free for the excavating. The clay and sod and cottonwood were where the creek left them. 14 pounds of prairie coal gathered free from the drainage kept her warmer than Pemberton's $94 solution on the worst nights of the winter. The richest lesson of the frontier is not always the most obvious one. It is not work hard or be brave or even be practical. Those things matter, but they're available to everyone. The lesson Clara Voss taught, or rather the lesson Witching Hota had already known and Clara had taken the time to receive, is simpler and harder. The knowledge that keeps you alive is often already present, held by people you've been taught to overlook, in places you've been trained not to look. The cost of arrogance on the American frontier was sometimes a frozen cow or a burned wagon wheel. Sometimes it was higher. The cost of humility, of asking, watching, learning from whoever had something worth learning, was nothing. Nothing at all. Clara's diary entry for October 24th, 1878, the morning after the worst of it, at -21 degrees outside, is 3 sentences long. Warm in the morning, found Mr. Halverson and Mr. Pemberton at my door, showed them what I know. That's all. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand something that doesn't get said often enough. The survival wisdom of the American frontier wasn't owned by one people or one tradition. It was assembled, tested, and refined by anyone who paid close enough attention to the land they were living on. Clara Voss paid attention. Witching Hota paid attention long before her. The blizzard didn't care about credentials or age or who had built their knowledge on which cultural tradition. It only cared about what worked. What worked was the earth. It works still. Below 4 feet in the Dakota soil, the temperature right now is 52 degrees. It's been 52 degrees there since before the first settler broke ground, and it'll be 52 degrees there long after the last house above it has weathered away. Some knowledge is that permanent. It only asks that someone stop long enough to learn it. These stories, the ones about who actually survived and how, the practical wisdom that kept people alive in brutal conditions, are the ones that deserve to be remembered. If you want to keep them alive, subscribe to this channel. There are hundreds more of them. People who built something real out of nothing in places that tried to kill them, using knowledge that history has largely forgotten. They deserve better than being forgotten. So do you, for having the patience to sit with a story like this one.